My name is Daniel Voss, and 3 years ago, I did something that got me banned from 2 neighborhood Facebook groups, 1 HOA newsletter, and, for about 6 months, my own street's holiday committee. I bought a power grid. Not the whole national power grid, obviously. I'm not a Bond villain. I bought the small private electrical cooperative that served exactly 1 neighborhood, mine. And I did it because a man named Gary Wexford decided that hanging Christmas lights on my own house was a threat to civilization as we know it. This is the story of how a dispute over a string of lights turned into the most satisfying 12 months of my adult life. Stick around, because the ending involves 4,000 LED bulbs, a very confused utility inspector, and an HOA president who had to watch the whole neighborhood glow like a runway while his own porch light flickered on a 5-minute delay. Let's start at the beginning. Part 1. The neighborhood. I live in a planned community called Hollow Pine Estates. It's the kind of place you'd see on a postcard. Matching mailboxes, uniform lawns, a community pond with 2 suspiciously photogenic geese. When my wife Renee and I bought our house there 8 years ago, the appeal wasn't the architecture or the golf course 2 miles down the road. It was the story the previous owners told us about Christmas. Every December, Hollow Pine used to turn into something out of a movie. Not garish, not tacky, just warm. Families walk their kids down the streets in pajamas and hot cocoa mugs. The old HOA board actually organized a luminary walk every year, where the whole neighborhood strung lights together and voted on categories like most creative and best use of icicle lights. I loved it. I grew up in a house that never decorated for anything, and something about that first December in Hollow Pine cracked something open in me. I went a little overboard with lights that year, and the year after, and every year since. Part 2. The new regime. Gary wasn't a bad person, exactly. He was the kind of man who alphabetized his garage and considered a slightly overgrown hedge a personal insult. He'd moved to Hollow Pine from a much stricter community 2 towns over, and he arrived with what I can only describe as a mission, to bring order to a neighborhood that, in his opinion, had let itself go soft. His first year, he tightened the mailbox paint code. His second year, he banned above-ground trampolines and instituted a strict 8 p.m. cutoff for any visible recreational lighting, whatever that meant. But it was his third year, my Christmas display 6th, when Gary set his sights on the lights. It started small. A letter in October, months before I'd even pulled the boxes out of the attic, reminding residents that excessive seasonal illumination was subject to HOA review under a newly revised Section 14, subsection C of the community bylaws. I didn't think much of it. HOAs love sending letters nobody reads. Then, the week after Thanksgiving, a second letter arrived. This one was addressed specifically to me. It cited my display by name, well, by address, and stated that displays exceeding 2,000 total lumens, or utilizing more than 3 colors in combination, may constitute a violation of community aesthetic standards and are subject to fines of $50 per day. I actually laughed out loud reading it. My wife thought I was joking when I read it to her. 2,000 lumens is nothing. A single decent floodlight blows past that. Under Gary's new rule, technically even a modest porch light with a wreath would be in violation. I called the HOA office. I was polite. Genuinely, I was. I asked whether this rule applied to everyone or just to us. The woman on the phone, a very tired-sounding property manager named Doreen, sighed and said, "Mr. Voss, I just processed the paperwork. You'll have to talk to Gary." So I talked to Gary. Part 3. The meeting. We met at the little clubhouse by the community pond. Beige carpet, a whiteboard, a bowl of hard candy nobody had touched since Labor Day. Gary greeted me with a firm handshake and the practiced smile of a man who has already decided how the conversation is going to end. "Daniel," he said, folding his hands on the table like we were negotiating a hostage release. "I want you to know, this isn't personal." "Gary, it has my house on the letter." "Right, well." He cleared his throat. "Your display has become something of a focal point. Traffic backs up on Cartonwood Lane during peak viewing hours. We've had 2 near accidents from people slowing down to look. And frankly, some residents feel it creates an unfair comparison. Not everyone can afford, or wants, that level of display, and it puts a certain pressure on the neighborhood." I sat with that for a second. "So the problem is that people like it too much." "The problem," Gary said, "is community harmony. Uniformity keeps property value stable and keeps friction low. That's literally the purpose of an HOA." I want to be fair to Gary here, because I've turned this into some diabolical villain origin story in my head 100 times, but the truth is he actually believed what he was saying. He wasn't lying awake at night twirling a mustache. He genuinely thought a neighborhood without visual variety was a healthier neighborhood. We just profoundly, fundamentally disagreed. I asked him what would happen if I decorated anyway. Fines, he said. Escalating. And after 90 days of non-compliance, the board can file a lien against the property. A lien. Over Christmas lights. I left that meeting more determined than I'd ever been about anything genuinely petty in my entire life. Renee, when I told her, just looked at me and said, "You're going to fight this, aren't you?" "I'm going to fight this," I said. I had no idea yet how. Part 4, The Discovery. Here's a detail about Hollow Pine Estates that most residents didn't know, and honestly, I only half knew it myself until that December. Hollow Pine was built in the early 1980s as an experimental self-sufficient community. Back then, the developer, a man named Arthur Pell, who I later learned was something of a local eccentric, didn't want to rely entirely on the regional utility company. So he built the neighborhood with its own small electrical distribution cooperative, a private substation, a network of local lines, and a governing entity called the Hollow Pine Light and Power Cooperative, which technically still existed, tucked away in some dusty filing cabinet, owning the actual infrastructure that delivered electricity to every house in the neighborhood. Over the decades, the co-op had become a formality. It bought bulk power from the regional grid and distributed it locally, charging residents a small monthly fee baked into their HOA dues. Nobody thought about it. It was infrastructure, invisible, boring, permanent, like the sewer lines or the sidewalks. I found out about all this by accident, digging through old county records because I was bored and angry and looking for literally any leverage I could find against Gary. What I discovered was that the co-op was structured as a member-owned utility, and membership shares had, over 40 years of nobody paying attention, become wildly undervalued and scattered. A huge portion of them, nearly 40%, was sitting unclaimed, tied to the estates of long-dead original homeowners, sold off decades ago to a holding company that had since dissolved. In other words, the co-op that physically delivered every watt of electricity to Hollow Pine Estates, including to the little control panel in the clubhouse that Gary loved so much, was sitting there, structurally unmanaged, and largely available. I'm not an electrician. I'm not an energy executive. I'm an accountant. But an accountant is exactly the kind of person who gets a little too excited reading 40-year-old cooperative bylaws at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. I called Renee into the office. "I think," I said, "I can buy the power company." She stared at me for a long moment. "Daniel, it's Christmas lights." "It was Christmas lights," I said. "Now it's principle." Part 5. Building the case. Buying a controlling stake in a dormant local utility cooperative is not something you do over a weekend. It took me nearly 4 months, most of a modest inheritance from my grandmother that I'd been saving for a kitchen remodel, and more phone calls to county clerks than I can count. Step 1 was tracking down the holding company that had absorbed the unclaimed shares. It had dissolved years earlier, but its assets, including those Hollow Pine Light and Power shares, had been passed to a small investment trust that had, quite frankly, forgotten it owned them. When I called and explained what I was looking at, the man on the other end laughed and said, "You want the what now?" Step 2 was negotiating a purchase price. Because nobody had thought about these shares in decades, they were absurdly cheap. The trust was happy to be rid of a paperwork headache for a number that, while not small to me, was nowhere near what 40% ownership of a real utility should have cost. I paid it. Renee, to her eternal credit, backed me the entire way, on one condition. If this didn't work, we were done with the kitchen remodel conversation forever. Deal. Step 3, and the trickiest, was consolidating enough of the remaining scattered shares to reach a genuine majority. Some were held by long-time residents who barely remembered owning them and were happy to sign over their tiny fractions for a case of good wine and a promise that their power bill wouldn't go up. A few were held by families who'd moved away decades ago. I tracked several of them down through old property records and offered fair buyouts. It took patience, a spreadsheet with more tabs than I'm proud of, and a small business lawyer named Priya Anand, who I hired the moment I realized I was in over my head legally. By late October, almost exactly a year after Gary's first warning letter, I held 61% ownership of the Hollow Pine Light and Power Cooperative. I was, on paper, the controlling authority over every home's electricity in the neighborhood, including the HOA clubhouse, the community pond fountain, the entrance gate lighting, and Gary Wexford's beige, meticulously trimmed house on Sycamore Court. There was a strange moment, sitting in Priya's office with the final ownership paperwork in front of me, where the reality of what I'd done actually hit me. I wasn't just a homeowner with a grudge anymore. I was, legally, a utility operator. I had to review basic safety compliance reports. I had to understand load capacity and seasonal demand forecasting, none of which I'd ever thought about in my life. Priya connected me with a retired electrical engineer named Walt, who used to consult for the regional grid, and he walked me through everything over 2 long Saturday afternoons. How the substation fed each block, where the aging transformers were, which lines would need replacing in the next decade regardless of anything happening with Gary. It turned out the co-op hadn't been maintained particularly well in years, precisely because nobody with real ownership stake had been paying attention. That part, at least, felt like something worth fixing regardless of how the Christmas lights dispute turned out. I did not, to be clear, plan to cut anyone's power. That was never the point, and honestly, doing that would have made me the villain of this story instead of Gary. The point was something much simpler, and much better. The point was that I no longer needed the HOA's permission for anything involving electricity in my own home, because I was, functionally, the electric company. Part 6. The letter I sent back. In early November, right on schedule, Gary's third letter arrived. Same language. Same threats. $50 a day, Leon after 90. This time, I wrote back. I kept it polite. I always kept it polite. That was important to me. I wasn't interested in humiliating Gary personally. I was interested in winning, cleanly, on the merits. My letter explained, in calm and specific terms, that as majority owner of the Hollow Pine Light and Power Cooperative, I would be reviewing the community's electrical service agreements, including the terms under which the HOA clubhouse and common areas receive their power, and that I looked forward to discussing mutually beneficial arrangements going forward. I attached a copy of the cooperative's original 1983 charter, which, I'd learned from Priya, actually granted the Light and Power Cooperative certain rights of oversight regarding electrical infrastructure decisions in the community that technically superseded newer HOA bylaws written decades later, since the HOA's own governing documents had never formally revoked the co-op's founding authority. Nobody had noticed this for 40 years because nobody had ever needed to. I requested a meeting with the board. I got one within 48 hours. Part 7. The second meeting. This time, it wasn't just Gary and me at the little clubhouse table. It was the full board, 5 people, looking considerably less relaxed than the hard candy bowl between them, plus Doreen from the property management office, plus, at my request, Priya, sitting quietly beside me with a folder thick enough to double as a doorstop. Gary opened by trying his old tone. Daniel, I appreciate you reaching out, but I don't think a business dispute is the appropriate venue for a decorating disagreement. It's not a business dispute, I said. It's a clarification of authority. Gary, do you know who currently owns the majority stake in the electrical cooperative that powers this clubhouse? Silence. Because I do, I said. It's me. I watched something behind Gary's eyes recalibrate in real time. Priya walked the board through it, plainly, professionally, no theatrics. The co-op's founding charter. The oversight clause. My controlling ownership stake, verified and filed with the county that very week. I wasn't threatening to shut off anyone's power, I told them clearly, because that was never the plan and never would be. What I was doing was formally notifying the HOA, as the majority controlling member of the utility that served every home in the neighborhood, that Section 14, subsection C, the lighting restriction Gary had personally drafted and pushed through the board without a full resident vote, which Priya's research had also uncovered, conflicted with the cooperative's original charter provisions guaranteeing residents reasonable and non-discriminatory access to electrical usage within standard residential load limits for their own properties. In plain English, 40 years ago, Arthur Pell had written a rule that basically said the HOA can't arbitrarily restrict how much electricity residents use in their own homes, as long as it's within safe limits. Gary's lumens rule violated that. He just never expected anyone to check. One of the other board members, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia who I later learned had voted against Gary's lighting rule from the start, actually smiled a little. I did wonder about that, she said quietly. Gary tried one more angle. Even if that's technically true, the board can still fine for aesthetic violations under general HOA authority. You can, Priya said, but any resident subject to those fines would have strong grounds to challenge them in light of the charter conflict, and frankly, Mr. Wexford, Given that the original vote on Section 14 didn't meet your own bylaw's quorum requirement for restrictions touching utility usage, I'd strongly recommend the board reconsider before this becomes a matter for the state's HOA Ombudsman Office. I hadn't even known there was a state HOA Ombudsman Office. Priya was worth every penny. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Patricia said, "I move we suspend Section 14 pending full board review," and to my genuine surprise, 2 other board members seconded it before Gary had fully processed what was happening. It passed, 4-1. Part 8. December. I want to tell you Gary showed up at my door with cookies and a heartfelt apology, but that's not what happened, and honestly, that's not the story I set out to tell you anyway. What actually happened was smaller, and better. The lights went up. All of them. 6 years worth of collecting, plus a few new additions Renee and I had been saving for the year we finally won. Icicle lights along the roofline. Warm gold wrapped around every porch column. The wooden sleigh, repainted for the occasion. And this year, for the first time, string lights along our fence line that connected, almost symbolically, toward the Nguyen's yard next door, who'd always wanted to decorate more but worried about Gary's rules too. Word got around the neighborhood fast, not through any announcement I made, but the way these things always do, one porch conversation at a time. By the second week of December, 4 other houses on Cartonwood Lane had strings of lights up that hadn't been decorated in years. The old luminary walk tradition, dead since the board changeover, got quietly revived by Patricia and a group of neighbors, unofficially, without asking Gary's permission at all. On the night of the walk, families came out in pajamas again, hot cocoa mugs steaming in the cold, kids running ahead pointing at the brightest houses. Someone had put together a simple map on the neighborhood app. It wasn't as big as the old HOA run version, but it felt, if anything, more genuine, reclaimed rather than organized. I remember standing at the end of our driveway that night, watching my daughter drag Renee by the hand toward the Nguyen's new light-up reindeer, and thinking about how quiet Cartonwood Lane had become over the past couple of years without anyone really noticing a happening. It's a strange thing, watching a neighborhood slowly lose its color one small rule at a time. You don't clock it in the moment. You just wake up one December and realize nobody strings lights anymore, and everyone assumes that's simply how things are now. It took one loud, petty, thoroughly documented dispute to remind everyone that it hadn't always been that way, and it didn't have to stay that way either. Gary's house, I should mention, stayed dark that year except for a single motion-activated porch light. I didn't gloat about it. I didn't need to. Someone else on the walk did that for me, joking that even the HOA president's own light bulb apparently needed board approval. Part 9. What actually changed? Here's the part of the story I think matters more than the lights themselves. I never used my ownership stake to punish anyone. I want to be completely clear about that, because it would have been easy, and it would have made me exactly the kind of small, controlling person I'd spent a year fighting against. I didn't raise Gary's rates. I didn't flicker his porch light for a joke, no matter how tempting that setup sounds in a story like this. I didn't even push for a full takeover of the co-op's remaining shares. Once I realized the leverage I already had was enough to do what actually mattered. Instead, Priya and I worked with the board, the Real board, not just Gary, to formally update the HOA bylaws so Section 14 couldn't be reinstated in its old form. We wrote in a simple, fair standard. Reasonable seasonal displays were protected, with actual, sensible limits on things like noise after 10 p.m. and safety-related sightline rules near intersections. Nothing about lumens. Nothing about aesthetic harmony. Just common sense. Gary, to his credit, didn't fight the new rules once they passed. I think some of the fight went out of him that December, watching a neighborhood that had felt, under his leadership, increasingly beige and quiet, light itself back up almost overnight. He served out his term. He didn't run for re-election the following spring. Patricia did, and won easily. As for the co-op, it's still there, still technically owned in majority by me, still boring and invisible the way good infrastructure should be. I don't run it like some private kingdom. I show up to the quarterly meetings. I make sure rates stay fair. Mostly, I just make sure nobody ever again gets to unilaterally decide that a neighborhood isn't allowed to shine a little in December. Part 10. Why I'm telling you this. I think about that first meeting with Gary sometimes, the way he talked about harmony, about keeping things uniform so nothing ever stood out too much. I understand the instinct. Some part of it probably even comes from a good place, a desire to keep the peace. But I've come to believe that real harmony in a community doesn't come from making sure nobody's house is brighter than anyone else's. It comes from people feeling free enough and safe enough to actually express who they are, whether that's an elaborate light display or a completely undecorated house that just wants to be left alone. Both of those should be allowed to exist on the same street. I didn't buy a power grid because I wanted power, ironically enough. I bought it because I wanted the ability to say no to a rule that had no good reason behind it, and I happened to find an unusual, very specific tool to do that with. Most people fighting their HOA don't have a 40-year-old dormant utility cooperative sitting in the county records waiting to be noticed. I got lucky. But the underlying lesson, I think, holds up regardless. Read the actual documents. Governing bylaws, charters, old contracts. These things are usually longer and more boring than anyone wants to deal with, which is exactly why so few people ever check what they really say. Somewhere in that boredom is often the leverage you need. This December will be our 9th year decorating the house on Cartonwood Lane. The sleigh's getting a little worn around the edges. We've had to repaint it twice now, and one of the runners has a crack Renee keeps insisting we should just replace with a new one, though neither of us actually wants to. Our daughter's old enough now to help hang the lower strings herself, standing on the same step stool I used the very first year, back before any of this started, back when a string of lights was still just a string of lights and not, somehow, a lesson in reading the fine print. And every year, right around the first week of December, a little bit of Hollow Pine Estates lights up again, not because anyone has to, but because, for the first time in a long time, everyone finally gets to. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking with me. And if there's a Gary in your neighborhood, my advice is simple: don't get angry. Get thorough. Somewhere in the paperwork, there's usually a way through. Happy holidays, from our house to yours.